Hello and welcome to this online lesson on the Spanish Civil War. Today's focus is going to be on the origins of the Spanish Civil War, or the causes of the Spanish Civil War. This is actually quite a complicated topic, right? There's no getting away from that. There's a lot of information, a lot of kind of different organisations, a lot of events that are going to be thrown at you. I'm going to try and minimise them today, right, so as to not burden you too much early on. You will get a chance to read yourself some key chapters in preparation for a tutorial, and that's when a lot of the detail will start to kind of emerge. So I'll try and stick to kind of themes today, and I might make reference to some events without going into them in too much detail, and that's just partly to do with not complicating things and not taking up too much of your time. But there's something about the Spanish Civil War which I think is very much worthwhile examining, because yes, it may be another example of a totalitarian state in Europe, but it's very different to the examples that we see in Germany. It's a bit more similar to what we see in Italy, but even then it's a different form of fascism. And it's an interesting story, just the origins of the war itself, and then if you were really interested in this topic, you could look at the conflict and then what comes after with Franco in power, and you could you could explore this in much greater detail. And what makes this story interesting is that we see kind of the political polarisation that does exist in other parts of Europe at this point, between the left and between the right, between the forces of conservatism and the more kind of radical elements within society. And I guess what we see is that the kind of the way that Europe is going to kind of develop in terms of a kind of democratic bloc of powers, the Allies fighting against the axis of evil, the fascist powers of Italy and Germany, and obviously Japan are part of this as well. That's kind of already getting played out in Spain prior to 1939. In fact, as you probably know, the Spanish Civil War ends in 1939. And World War II then eclipses it. The other kind of element of this is, for those on the political left, the Spanish Civil War means a lot to them, because they were very, ordinary working class people in many European countries and from America and from China. Ordinary working people were invested in this war, and they kind of play a role in attempting to defeat fascism before democratic countries like Britain and France try and defeat fascism, or before the United States tries to defeat fascism. An interesting story of this, or linked to this, is that in the United States we have this term that is given to those who joined the Spanish Civil War International Brigades. Right, these are communists, not always, but mostly communists, who joined the Abraham Lincoln Battalion and went to Spain. Not with, they weren't allowed to do this. They did this in a clandestine manner. The American government were opposed to any type of intervention, but they go to Spain and they fight for the Democratic Republic, and they're referred to by the American government, by the CIA, when they return home, as premature anti-fascists. And what is meant by that is that they were anti-fascist too early. It was okay to be anti-fascist fighting the Nazis and Mussolini and the period from when America gets involved in the war, but they were really too far ahead of their time. And what really we mean by premature anti-fascist is that you were a communist if you went out to Spain to fight against the rebel forces led by Franco, which is not always true, right? Some were just Democrats, some were kind of romantics, some were Trotskyists, some were communists, and all these other kind of potential left-wing groups, anarchists as well. So it's just a fascinating war. So much can come from a study of the Spanish Civil War. But you'll be thankful to know that we're only talking about the origins. There's a little video clip here you can watch in time. It's a nice little animation. Well, it's not a nice animation because it's about what is known as the Malaga Almeria Road Massacre. And this event from 1937 occurs when the war is already underway, and it just shows you again the nature of the Spanish Civil War. It was an international conflict, and that Italians and Germans were assisting the Spanish military in their attempts to destroy the Democratic Republic that had been elected in 1936. And Britain and France and America are all standing back, allowing this to happen. It definitely gives the Germans, the Italians an edge when it comes to the outbreak of the Second World War. The fact that they've got a trial run, brutalising mostly through air, but also, as you see in this example, from the Italian Navy, brutalising the Spanish population. So it's a very ugly war, the Spanish Civil War. Okay, so this is the basics we're going to start with. What was the Spanish Civil War? Then we'll get into the origins and the causes. And I guess a question, if it was to come up in the exam, really couldn't be radically different than something along the lines of what were the causes of the Spanish Civil War. Naturally, it would be phrased in a different way, but that's really what we're looking at here: long-term causes and short-term causes. Now, the conflict lasts for 3 years. It takes place between the military rebels led initially by a Spanish general called General Mola, but very quickly the military would be led by Francisco Franco, who would then become the kind of jefe, the leader, the dictator of Spain from 1939 right up until his death in 75. And that's an interesting thing again about the Spanish Civil War, is that the outcome of it is a dictatorship that doesn't disappear in 45 when the Germans and the Italian fascist powers are obviously brought to heel. There was a view among some Republicans in exile, that's those who supported the democratic elected government, and they believed that eventually, once Germany and Italy had been defeated, then Europe would assist and help remove Franco from Spain. It doesn't happen. In fact, America under Eisenhower kind of start to strike up some good relations with Franco, and the Spanish are very much open to American investment. And right up until 1975, he's in power. He obviously dies as an old man. In fact, many of you might already be aware of the fact that package holidays to Spain, places that eventually will become Benidorm and whatnot, that begins in the kind of 60s, the late 60s, and you get British tourists going on holiday. They're going on holiday to what is technically a fascist state, an anti-democratic state. Now I know there might be some parallels with other countries around the world that people go on holiday to that are not the most democratic, whether it be Turkey or the United Arab Emirates. But here we had actually a fascist in power who had committed serious crimes against his people, and British tourists were going over there and enjoying the Spanish sun. Unless you were on the political left, and you tended to boycott these types of holidays whilst Franco was still in power. So that was they were the two sides. Franco is triumphant. To really understand the origins, we have to touch on the long-term factors first of all, then we'll focus on the shorter term, what's sometimes referred to as conjunctural factors. In another lesson, we will touch on the Spanish Revolution. Right, we're not going to cover that today, but then we will get a chance to look at the attempted kind of revolutionary approach adopted by those on the left during the war. So let's begin with I guess a little bit of longer term context. I just want to show you this book here because I'm going to actually talk quite a lot about the work of Paul Preston, because Paul Preston has written more than anybody else on Spain in the English language anyway. And he's prolific. He spent a lot of his time in Spain. He lived there for about 20 years, so he could read all of these Spanish sources. And Paul Preston he wrote so many books. Right, his first kind of major book that he wrote was about Franco himself. So he's an expert in Franco. I'm going to show you some extracts from this book on the Sway presentation. I'm just going to kind of touch on them very briefly. But for the tutorial, you have to read a couple of chapters from Preston. These chapters are fairly short, but they're from a different book, right? This book, The Spanish Holocaust, is a bit of a beast, right? It's a really dense book. The version of Preston's work that I'm going to get to is a shorter work. It's just called The Spanish Civil War, Reaction, Revolution and Revenge, and it's a more concise version of the Spanish Holocaust. The Spanish Holocaust is a contentious term, isn't it? Because obviously in the 20th century we have obviously the Holocaust, something we get to study, and what we get in Spain is this idea that there was a kind of Holocaust, if you like, a kind of desire to exterminate people within Spain, right? But the Holocaust in Spain, the extermination, the planned, right, premeditated extermination of Spaniards, is different. It's not based on race, it's not based on the extermination of the Jews, it's based on the extermination of the Spanish working class. And this and the Spanish working class were obviously seen as being racially inferior to the middle classes, racially inferior versions of Spaniards, and therefore the the title of this book that Preston uses is one in which he did think a lot about because of the words that we associate with Holocaust. But there was a kind of desire for him to use it because it's almost as if the story of what went on in Spain, the mass destruction, the mutilation of ordinary working people and peasants was kind of ignored. So by using this term and this phrase, it kind of brought back into the light the view about what exactly happened within Spain. And I think Holocaust is quite a useful word. So the next slide that I want to show you as part of this online lecture is about the structural factors, right? So we'll come back to Preston's book, as I said, but the structural factors are important, right, because they kind of set out what the two different sides are going to be in this Spanish Civil War. So on the one hand, you've got workers and peasants, right, the group who are mostly affected, the group that are exterminated, right, as I said, through this kind of planned attempt by the military. So they're on one side, and on the other side you've got the forces of, I guess, privilege and power and wealth, and that will include, pro-monarchists, aristocrats, wealthy landowners, the industrialists, and the military. The Catholic Church are part of this as well. So here are some of the kind of debates or contrasting positions that they're not really debates, right, because there's not much talking, there's lots of violence that we see in Spain in the 30s. But here are the contrasting positions. You get regionalists versus centralists. So regionalists are your kind of Catalan nationalists versus obviously the government located in Madrid, who is opposed to any form of separation or autonomy. Then you've got the landless labourers versus the latifundistas. The latifundistas are your wealthy landowners. The landless labourers are your peasants, constantly in opposition to each other. Then you've got the slightly more modern class conflict position between workers and factory owners, industrialists. Spain has not really modernised in the way that other European countries have, so you've got a little bit of an industry in Catalonia and the Barcelona region. You get some coal mines in the Asturias regions and in the Basque country, but it's pretty limited. But there is a working class, right, and many of this kind of industrial working class vote socialist, and the industrialists obviously vote their own bourgeois parties. And then you've got the anti-clerical groups within Spain and the Catholic Church. And the anti-clerical groups are quite often associated with the anarchists. But we should note, right, that church attendance in Spain is quite low. By the time we get to the 1930s, we're talking about less than 20% of Spaniards going to mass who would say that they were devout Catholics. I'm not saying that there weren't members of the remainder of the population who would still regard themselves as Catholic, but they just don't practice it. So here are, as I said, these kind of different positions, different ideological positions that existed within Spain, and eventually the regionalists will side with the landless labourers and the workers, and I guess the anarchists, the anti-clerical groups, and then the Catholic Church, the industrialists, the wealthy landowners, and the kind of centralists. They will kind of club together, and we throw into that the army as well, and that's where you get the two sides, the left, the political left, and the political right. Now the historian I just mentioned, Paul Preston, uses a really good term to try and help us make sense of how politics and how elections played out over the kind of 1930s, and he uses this term, the pendulum, right? That's an easy image to obviously get your head around. And he says that the pendulum would swing back and forward. So prior to 1931, when we have the beginning of what we call the Second Republic, prior to 1931, we have got the I guess the right who are in the ascendancy, right? There's never really been any opportunity for proper democracy in Spain before 1931. I should say, right, that in 1871 Spain was, in some respects, a kind of constitutional monarchy, right? You had the king as the head of the state, you had a prime minister who tried to command a majority, and the Cortes, right? The Cortes is the word for the Spanish parliament. The Cortes would be elected by male population, But power tended to still rest in the hands of oligarchs, right? The kind of wealthy who could control and dictate who would be members of the kind of conservative and liberal parties. So democracy was a bit of a facade in the period between 1871 and 1931. Little changes. In fact, any opportunities to change something within Spanish society often had to be based on direct action and violence because the working class did not have a voice. It's a little bit like what Britain was like prior to the 1832 Reform Act or prior to Chartism. The army are key, I guess, to this this kind of period up until 1931. In fact, between 1923 and 1931, there was a military kind of regime in place. It was a kind of similar kind of regime to Mussolini's Italy, but nowhere near as extensive and nowhere near as kind of entrenched. It was Primo de Rivera, General Primo de Rivera, really had basically suspended democracy in Spain up until 1931. So the right were kind of in control, the army were kind of in the seat of power up until 1931. But the monarchy was not particularly popular. So in 1931, King Alfonso VIII, his reign comes to an end, and he's kind of held responsible for a whole range of things that Spain had experienced over this period. He was in power when Spain lost its empire to the United States. Spanish military also are defeated in Morocco. So he's just kind of not particularly popular. There's economic crisis as well in the 1920s and also the 1930s, early 30s as well. So Primo de Rivera has this fascist regime up until 1931, but that comes to an end, and the military don't support replacing de Rivera, partly because he's created a lot of problems with another military regime. What they decide is that there should be free elections, and there's a pact signed by kind of certain groups within Spain, liberal politicians, those who support the idea of Spain becoming democratic. It's known as the San Sebastian Pact. And then we have elections in April 1931, and the victors of this election are your liberal Republicans, your socialists, and some of your regionalist political parties. And as a result of that, the king decides to kind of abdicate. So the pendulum that we're talking about before 1931 is to the right. It swings back to the left in 1931 until November 33. There's new elections November 33, then this pendulum swings back to the right, and then in 1936 it swings back to the left until we have this uprising by the military in July of 1936, and it swings back to the right again. So the pendulum is a nice little metaphor for what happens, and it tells us that Spain is inherently unstable. There's not really any middle ground in Spain, hence why eventually violence and conflict will be required. I guess maybe a way to summarise what I've just spoken about is to think about the problems that Spain therefore has, right? So before we just kind of get to this first phase with the pendulum swinging to the left, you've got regional problems, a kind of new democracy, an interventionist military. The military have intervened before and they will probably intervene again, as you will see, or they definitely will intervene again. You've got a powerful conservative Catholic Church. You've got a backward economy, it's not modernised, it's not industrial. You've got deep-seated economic inequalities. And all of these issues, I guess, have to be resolved by this new government of 1931, which is a Republican Liberal government on the face of it. I'll just scroll down, but it's also, so this is the first bit of information you need, but it's also a government that has socialist members within it, because the Socialist Party are one of the dominant political parties at this point within Spain. They won 115 seats in this 1931 election, and they're getting their support from rural labourers and they're getting their support from the urban working class. The government is kind of dominated to some extent by the left, even though the Republican kind of liberals / conservatives are in the main positions, right? That's Zamora and Aznar. They are progressive in their outlook. Now, Aznar is a key figure, and we have in 1931 period right through until 1933 what we call the Aznar reforms. Now, the reforms are not all the creation of Manuel Azana himself, but when he's elected to this position of Prime Minister, when he sees an opportunity for Spain to progress, when he sees an opportunity for Spain to become a modern power, he decides that there are areas that require reform, and the areas that require reform are some of the ones I just mentioned as part of these long-term problems. There's going to be army reforms, agrarian reforms, church reforms, home rule reforms, and some economic reforms in general, but we'll talk about the agrarian ones right now. And they would do two things, right? They would give some hope to those on the political left, to the workers, to people who had voted for this new republic, but they would also alienate the political right. Hence why I've said that eventually these reforms would lead to what's known as the Sanjuro uprising. General Sanjuro attempts to overthrow the government in 1932. It fails, but it's a little precursor to what will happen in 1936 with Mola and then the Franco. So what would the reforms involve? Well, first of all, the military are seen as being too kind of powerful an organisation. They are kind of maybe required to kind of have their wings clipped slightly. So what we see are some reforms that try and bring down the amount of money spent on the military. What happens is a lot of the officer class are basically retired early. So a lot of generals as well are retired early. And military service is reduced within Spain, so it's no longer going to take up the lives of people as much as it had. And some of the main military schools were closed down. One of them in Zaragoza, right? The Zaragoza military school was closed down, and this actually is where Franco was based. And Franco was actually sent to the Canary Islands just to get him out of the way. He seen as maybe being too much of a threat, but Sanjuro was kept in place, and we can see that that was a mistake. So the reforms of the army don't necessarily work. All they do is they alienate the military, they turn the military against the regime. That's not to say the military wouldn't have already been against the regime anyway, right? They definitely would have. So that's one aspect of the reforms that are required. Agrarian reforms are really important, right? Because the kind of poorest of the poor in Spain are the peasants. And the plight of agricultural labourers was that food was often limited, that work could be seasonal, there was high levels of unemployment, that these rural workers had to rely quite heavily upon the goodwill of their wealthy landowner, and that wasn't something that existed often, goodwill. Large estates in central and southern Spain were dominated by this group, right? We call them the latifundia, right, or the latifundistas, and these men dominated local politics, and these wealthy landowners also had lots of control and power over what we call the civil guard. The civil guard are like the police force in rural areas, and they were a brutal bunch, right? And they were very much anti-peasant and pro-latifundia. The peasants in the countryside were influenced by two groups: the FNTT, which is just the agrarian wing of the Socialist Party, and then you've got another group, the anarchists. Very important. Anarchists, or anarchism as a concept, appealed to a lot of peasants in Spain. We don't get this in other parts of Europe, but anarchism in Spain is really popular amongst the kind of peasant class, who see this idea of a collective and social and economic collective as being a way of ensuring that poverty would be no more in rural areas. So some laws are implemented that will benefit peasants. I won't go into all of these at the moment, but they really were based around the idea that land that was not getting used by landowners could be taken from them by the state and used productively. You could not, one of the laws that said you could not hire anybody out with the local regional boundary. So what often was the case is that latifundistas or these wealthy aristocrats would hire workers in from poorer areas, sometimes even from Portugal, which was even poorer again, to drive down wages, and that was banned. So, and also there's the opportunity for workers to kind of organise now in trade unions. There's two trade unions, the UGT, which is the trade union of the Socialist Party, but the FNTT are the version of it in the countryside, and then you've got the CNT, which is the anarchist trade union. So you've got benefits, or what might be potentially beneficial reforms for the peasantry. There was church reforms implemented as well. I should say there was two very important articles to the new Spanish constitution. Right at this point, the Spanish constitution is drawn up by obviously this new government, right? This new kind of coalition government, and it kind of causes controversy because they actually state that this is going to be a republic of workers. Now, it does say it's going to be the new Spanish Republic from 1931, right? The Second Republic. It's going to be a Spanish republic of workers of all classes, but just that phrase "workers" again gives the suggestion maybe this is going to be more of a pro-working class, regime. But there are two articles. Article 26 was a anti-Catholic Church article, and then you've got Article 44, which is was one of the reforms associated with land. Again, land could be taken from wealthy landowners and redistributed if they had not used this land productively. But Article 26 was about the Catholic Church, and Article 26 stated that the church would no longer be funded by the state. Now, if you add to that that things like divorce were now acceptable, it did seem like there was an attack on the Catholic Church and Christianity in general, and the kind of moral position that the church gave to the country and the influence that the church gave to the country. So here we're seeing three attacks or three reforms that are being perceived as attacks to the army, to wealthy landowners, and now to the Catholic Church. And if we add into that home rule reforms, this proposition that the new republic suggested that we could basically have a Catalan republic within the wider Spanish states. It wouldn't be complete independence, but it would be pretty much as much autonomy as could be given. That upsets nationalists as well, who think, wait a minute, Spain is being undermined here by giving more powers to the Catalans. And Catalan government and the Catalan Parliament had been shut down prior to 1931. Now, here's where things get a little bit complicated. And as I said, I'm not going to run through all of these pages, right? But I've given you the page numbers that you can look on, and if you click, you can see the page numbers at the top here. You can click on these to expand them. And if this was a topic that came up in an exam, was a question we're going to look at, you would want to look through these extracts from the Spanish Holocaust by Paul Preston. One of the problems that we see in Spain for the new government is that on the one hand they alienate the right, on the other hand maybe they're not doing enough to assist the left, right? So you kind of have a little bit of sympathy for the kind of moderate centre-left democratic government of Zamora and Azana. And the problem they have is that the anarchists are really impetuous. They want social revolution, right? They want significant change, and they are quite happy to cause anarchy, chaos wherever possible, right? And so one of the examples we see is there's two examples, right? They stage a telephone worker strike in Seville really early on in the regime, right? July 1931, and you can read about it in pages 15 and 16. And what this leads to is, by the way, I should say page 14 also talks about church burnings. One of the things that the anarchists did a lot of in the early days of the Republic was burn down churches. And again, that's also going to upset those on the political right. The anarchists are seen as being out of control. And maybe Zamora and Azana's democratic elected Republican government does not do enough to really defend the Catholic Church in these instances. They kind of just take a step back. In fact, Azana makes a statement where he says, basically, no convent or church basically is equal to the life of a Republican. So he's kind of dismissive of the Catholic Church. You could even say he's kind of anti-clerical, possibly himself. So there's a little bit on page 14 about churches being burnt, but the Seville telephone strike of the summer of 1931 does cause some problems because the telephone network is controlled by the American A&T network. America being obviously invested in Spain. And the strike takes place, the Americans say, look, we need you to intervene here. So the government does feel forced to intervene, and the civil guard are called out, and the civil guard brutally suppress this strike, and some anarchists are killed. So what you get on the one hand is an already alienated right, but now you're alienating the left, at least those on the kind of far left, the anarchists, and they don't see the Republic doing what it should be doing for them. We then see another example of brutality towards the peasants, right, anarchist peasants in a small town called Castilla Blanco. Again, you can see this on page 21, where basically it was a kind of accident. A kind of worker was shot accidentally, so we believe by a civil guard member. But the kind of terror and fear that came with that was that the workers then jumped on the guards and beat them to death. I think they beat 4 civil guards to death. But the revenge that came after it, led by General Sancuro, at a place called Badajoz in Casablanca, was incredibly repressive. In fact, if you go to page 21 and 23, you'll get a kind of sense of just how little concern there was for life for these kind of working class. Remember, we've used this term, the Spanish Holocaust, right? Or Preston uses the term on page 22, right, of the, which I think is the next one. On page 22, on the top left hand side, right, you get an idea of what this kind of almost racial understanding of the working class was. This idea that they were almost of a lower race, a different breed of people. That's why Preston uses this term Holocaust, and he talks about how in Castilla Blanco the inhabitants, this is this line here, the inhabitants of Castilla Blanco, and by extension the rural proletariat as a whole, right, so this is a general position, were presented as an inferior race, horrible examples of racial degeneration. It was common for them to be described as subhuman and abnormal. Colourfully exaggerated descriptions pandered to the ancestral fears of the respectable classes. The allegation that a woman had danced on the corpses recalled the witches' Sabbath. The often explicit conclusion was that the rural proletariat should be disciplined in the same way as the colonial enemy in Morocco had been. So the kind of argument here that Preston puts forward is that the empire had been internalised. So Spain loses its external empire, right? We know about that. Cuba, Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, etc. And they internalise it. They then use brutality against the working class in Spain, the peasants, the rural proletariat. So I just thought it was worthwhile kind of pointing out that little extract. So what we kind of see is that, and then by the way, then there's a CNT, an anarchist uprising, and another small place called Casas Viejas, which is also brutally suppressed by the civil guard and army. So the point I'm making here is, or the point that Preston as well tries to make, is that on the one hand, you've got a real problem for the government. They've got this kind of anarchist thorn on the side. On the other hand, you've got the forces on the right who also don't like the route that you're going down. They're rejecting even kind of moderate reforms. And therefore you really get both sides of the pendulum detesting this new Republican government. Eventually the Socialist Party, right, the POSE, the Partido Socialista Obrero España, or Español, were seen as being in a fairly difficult situation because they didn't want to support the government because they believed the government was too moderate. But they knew also the repercussions if they didn't support the government could fall and the forces on the right could take over. And that's what happens. Largo Caballero, the leader of the Socialist Party, decides not to support the government in the 1933 election, and as a result, some socialists don't vote for the kind of Popular Front government, and the right triumph in 1933, and the pendulum swings to the right. This period is sometimes known as the Bienio Negro, right, the 2 dark years. So we kind of see a new type of governance in Spain, which is kind of becoming more fascistic, right? And that the party that you can see here, CEDA, right, this group here, which just stands for the Confederation of autonomous right-wing parties in Spain, was led by a guy called Gil Robles, and he had spent time in 1933 at the Nuremberg rally, watching Hitler, watching the Nazis, watching all the paraphernalia, and he was, kind of impressed by this, and he brings a lot of that back to Spain with him. So you really can't do have a fascist in office. The Spanish right are kind of the view that they have this kind of theory, if you like, or 2 different ideological theories or positions. One is known as the accidentalists and one is known as the catastrophists. The accidentalists are quite willing to use the parliamentary system if required, as long as they're getting their own way, right? That policies are right wing and so on, and the left are put in place. So they're known as the accidentalists. They'll deal with whatever they have to within the system. But then you've got the catastrophists who think that the system itself is broken. That tends to be the military who think there has to be a complete overhaul of democracy, even though democracy is very new, right? It's still in its infancy, just a couple of years old since the beginning of the Republic. Now, one of the things that really starts to appear again and again and again is right-wing propaganda undermining the Republic and undermining the left-wing forces. And one of the period 33 to 36 is known as the Bienio Negro, right, or the Two Dark Years, because of the treatment of the working class. I mean, it's so much worse than it had been prior to. It was pretty bad, right, between 31 and 33, and that was with a Republican left-wing government in place. It's so much worse during this next period, right? Constant attacks on the rural proletariat. The right-wing government and the right-wing press, right-wing media, create this idea that there's a Jewish Masonic Bolshevik conspiracy that has come to Spain, it's going to attack Spain, it's going to undermine all of the values of family, the values of religion and God, all of that is under threat. And some of the most kind of pro, if you like, eventually kind of totalitarian, dictator, fascist groups are those that are associated with the Catholic Church. And one group is known as the Carlists. They've got their own kind of militia, their own paramilitary group, this religious group called the Requetti, and they are happy to carry out violent attacks. So you're really seeing the army, the police force, the civil guard, Catholic paramilitary groups, the wealthy landowners using the civil guard to really attack the working class. Class warfare is alive and well within Spain in the 1930s, and it's brutal and it is violent, and most of that violence comes from the right. And okay, you will get the odd anarchist attempt to stage a little strike here or some type of action there, but it's fairly limited. Until 1934, we have what we call the Asturias Rising. Now, what's interesting about the Asturias Rising, right, and you can see Preston's views on this in the following pages, right, so you can read through these again in your own time if required. The Asturias Rising is the one occasion when the Socialist Party, the Anarchists and the Communist Party are pretty small within Spain at this point, but they have backing from Moscow, which is very important, something we'll come to in a future lesson. The Asturias Rising is an attempt in Asturias to set up a kind of workers' government, and it's quite close to being successful. It's successful for a short period, but it's then brutally suppressed by the military. And the one individual who is given the task of destroying this working class action is General Francisco Franco. Franco here basically treats Asturias in the way that he will eventually treat the rest of the country. And workers are imprisoned, workers are brutally shot. It's a real defeat for those on the left. It looks like Spain will just continue perhaps to be what it was like between 1923 and 1931, i.e. not necessarily democratic, but much more violent. But the 1933 government, 1933 to 36 government does fall, and the reason that it falls is partly because of Alejandro Lerroux, who was head of the Radical Party. The Radical Party sound like they might be kind of left wing, they're not. They're a right wing reactionary, populist radical party, and they. The corruption and scandal involved with this political party means that eventually, and this party were fundamental actually to FEDA being in power, because there's much more radical party members, ironically, than there are FEDA members or CEDA members. So this government falls, and what happens is those on the left and centre left come together and they form what was known as the Popular Front, and this was an attempt to seize back power at the polls by kind of burying the hatchet between those on the radical left and those on the kind of centre left, although the anarchists are not initially involved in this Popular Front, but the Socialist Party are back involved, and there's some communists involved. And we see a victory for the Popular Front, for the left, in 1936, between February 36 and July 36, with phase 3, where the pendulum swings back to the left again. The problem here is this is the final straw for those on the political right, because the system is clearly a system that will allow for this toing and throwing. And what we get in 1936, after the success, and we have a new president, Aznar. The position of president right now, or from this point, and a new prime minister, a guy called Caceres Quiroga. The Socialist Party don't get involved in the government, even though they back the Popular Front. So it seems like it's a more kind of solid, middle class, liberal, Popular Front, pro-democratic, progressive ideas, pro-modernisation governments in power. But that is too much for those on the right. And those on the right are particularly upset about how the political left, so the socialists not in government but the socialists on the streets, the anarchists not in government but the anarchists on the streets, how they respond. They see this as being the beginnings of a new social revolution, and all of the reforms that had been implemented, the Azana reforms of 1931, which had been completely ignored or suppressed between 33 and 36, they were now back on the agenda, and political prisoners were released. There was fear on the right of maybe potentially more radical left-wing policies. So we get in Spain real violence in the summer of 1936, and there's tit-for-tat killings, and one of them is the murder of Carlos Sotelo, who was a leading spokesperson in the Cortes for the right, for the Catholic monarchist pro-military section of the parliament. So what we really get, I mean, the ultimate cause of the Spanish Civil War is a military uprising. The military just say no more. We are going to remove democracy, even though it's a democratically elected government. We're going to bring this to an end. The coup had been in the making for a while, so the military uprising of 1936 is planned by General Mola, supported by General Franco, who's flown in from the Canary Islands, supported by Sancuro, who's out of prison by this point, and many other generals. And it's also supported by the Falange, right, who are, this group here, sometimes it looks like it says Phalange, right, Phalange or Falange, who are like kind of the fascist group within Spain. They're not that popular, right, they're known as the blue shirts, they're not that big, they're not a major force, they're not like the brown shirts or the black shirts in Italy necessarily. They don't play a key role, I mean they're very much involved in street fighting, but they don't play a key role in this military uprising. So you've got on the right, fascist military, Catholics, Carlists, that's extreme position in the Catholic Church, the capitalist class and wealthy landowners, and they are now going to be up against Democrats, Republicans, regionalists, so like the Catalans and the Basques, socialists, anarchists, and a very small group of communists. You can even throw in the mix some Trotskyists as well. The country is set up for a war. It's not a war that the political left has wanted, it's been imposed upon them. You can see here the way that the war will eventually break out. The blue part, the centre of the country, the way that the coup occurs, it puts power in the hands of this heart of the country, if you like, in the hands of the right and the military uprising. And then everywhere else, we have got the kind of Republican government. Madrid is stuck in the middle. It's really contained here around or surrounding it are the forces of the right. And what we mean by that is that the uprising was accepted by kind of locals in these areas. It wasn't accepted in the rest of the country, and that's partly to do with anarchists, socialists, communists forcing the military positions within these areas to not accept the military uprising. But once the country is in this position here, then well, one or two things could have happened. The uprising could have eventually just have made its way across the rest of the country without any opposition, or there will be opposition from those on the left, and the opposition will lead to war. And we have 3 years, it takes 3 years for the Spanish military, with all the power, all the advantages that they had, including the advantages of Hitler and Mussolini intervening and the German Luftwaffe, and Italian fascist troops. It still takes them 3 years to defeat workers, to defeat, I guess, some of the more reliable elements within the army, and eventually to defeat the international brigades, who are workers from all over the world who come in to support the Spanish Republic. No help is given from the French or the British or the Americans. Only two countries really help. I mean, the French do give a tiny little bit of help, but on the whole they don't. The real help comes from Mexico, but the majority of the help comes from the Soviet Union. And even then, Stalin is kind of reluctant to get involved for other reasons that I'll get to in a future class. So I know there's quite a lot of information, I threw quite a lot of stuff at you there. A lot of the detail I kind of missed out on, right, in terms of events, so that we could just focus on the bigger picture. But hopefully it gives you a sense of what the Spanish Civil War was about, and we can fill in the detail when it comes to the tutorial. But that is all for now. Thank you very much.